During the Nazi era, there were some very crazy plans, including the gigantic world city of Germania, a wall that would shield the entire Atlantic coast, and even the creation of genetically modified super soldiers. However, one project puts all these projects in the shade once again: the Atlantropa Plan. This extraordinary idea, developed by German architect Herman Sörgel in the 1920s, envisaged the construction of a gigantic dam in the Strait of Gibraltar. The aim was to lower the water level of the Mediterranean bit by bit, in order to eventually dry it out completely and gain new land. However, under the rule of Adolf Hitler, this plan took on a threatening new dimension. Atlantropa was not only seen as an opportunity for territorial expansion, but also as a strategic weapon for gaining control of the entire Mediterranean region and merging Europe and Africa into a supercontinent. A Berlin-Rome-Cape Town axis was already being planned. So what was this incredible plan all about? What would the implementation have looked like in detail? Why did Hitler ultimately reject the plan, and would such a dam actually be possible in reality? We take a look at all these exciting questions in today's video. Have fun! As already mentioned, the crazy plan was the brainchild of Munich architect Hermann Sörgel. The idea came to him when he read in a geography book in 1927 that the Mediterranean was a sea of evaporation. This means that water from the Atlantic and the Black Sea is constantly flowing into the Mediterranean. As more water evaporates there than its tributaries can compensate for. And so he came up with an unusual idea. If the Strait of Gibraltar were to close, the water from the tributaries would not be enough to compensate for the evaporation. This would result in a rapid drop in sea level, and, according to his further calculations, the Mediterranean would eventually dry out completely. Man only needs to complete the work in the spirit of nature, he explained in his book about the work. His first book, Mediterranean Drainage, Sahara Irrigation, Panropa Project, was published in 1929. 3 years later, he expanded on his thesis in another book in which he introduced the title Atlantropa. Here he talks about the construction of several dams at important points in the Mediterranean. First at the Strait of Gibraltar and the Dardanelles, and later between Sicily and Tunisia. The sea was to be divided into 2 basins, with the western part being lowered by around 1 meter and the eastern part by 2 meters each year. Over the course of a century, the sea level would fall by 100 and 200 meters respectively, creating around 660,000 square kilometers of arable land. This area, larger than France, could be farmed to feed Europe's growing population. In addition, a massive land bridge would be created in the future in the middle of the former Mediterranean. Furthermore, further south in the heart of Africa, huge dams on the Congo, artificial lakes, and the enlargement of Lake Chad were to be realized. The African climate was to become milder, and the Sahara could be irrigated according to his plans. Even Albert Einstein was interested in Hermann Sörgel's plans, and the two had a long correspondence. And the Swiss civil engineer Bruno Ziegwart was one of the Munich architect's most important supporters. He also accompanied the first soundings at the Strait of Gibraltar in the 1920s. Sörgel immediately began traveling to the Strait of Gibraltar to continue the planning. Several million years ago, the Strait of Gibraltar had actually been closed off naturally, which led to a sharp drop in the water level in what is now the Mediterranean region, and the same was now to be repeated by the artificial hand of man. Sörgel thus drew up precise plans for his Atlantropa Dam. However, he did not actually opt for the narrowest point in the plans, but for the flattest one around 20 kilometers to the west. According to his notes, the foundation alone was to be 2.5 kilometers wide and up to 300 meters high. The construction time was estimated at 10 years. A total of 200,000 workers were to be employed in 4 shifts. The logistical problems of procuring building materials and transporting workers remained unresolved. However, one thing was certain. Atlantropa was to solve the burning problems of the 1920s and 1930s. Land scarcity, political and social tensions, including the renewed threat of war, unemployment, and poverty. On top of this, the Gibraltar Dam was to produce 50,000 megawatts of electricity per year. In addition to land reclamation, this would have meant greater independence for Europe's energy supply and lower consumption of fossil fuels to generate electricity. Economic integration and the industrial development of North Africa would have been added to this. A railroad line from Berlin to Cape Town was to become the symbol of the new united continent. And because the lowering of the Mediterranean would have pushed all the port cities of Barcelona, Venice, and Cairo far into the hinterland, renowned architects designed futuristic new cities. But of course, the project would also have had numerous disadvantages. Firstly, there were the geological problems. In addition to the dangers of plate tectonics, the dam would also have been exposed to an increased risk of tsunamis. If the dam had failed to hold even once, the project of the century would have failed. In addition, even small interventions in the Earth's surface can have gigantic proportions. For example, immense changes in pressure on the volcanically and seismically active zones in Italy, Greece, or Turkey. In addition, rainfall in North Africa would have been reduced even further, and the Sahara could have spread further. And the redistribution of water from the Mediterranean region to the world's oceans would cause sea levels to rise by around 1 meter worldwide. And this would possibly also affect the Gulf Stream, which is so important for Europe. The general impact on the Mediterranean climate would also have been unclear. But even apart from this, the consequences would be dramatic. Practically all existing ports in the Mediterranean would have been dry and would have had to be rebuilt, and the borders of all the countries bordering the Mediterranean would have shifted, which would have created further potential for conflict. And we haven't even mentioned the ecological consequences and the destruction of the habitat of thousands of species. Theoretically, such a construction might have been possible, but the risks would have dwarfed everything else. However, the motives for Atlantropa also changed over time. Originally, Sörgel developed the plans against the backdrop of a grand post-national and pacifist utopia. However, from the 1930s onwards, he quickly adapted the plans and his own political views to National Socialism. A few years later, there was little talk of a common European-African cultural area. On the contrary, he wrote in 1932, "By incorporating Africa into the Western cultural sphere, it is still possible today to dominate the black race, and, through the strengthening of Europe into Atlantropa, the silting up and Bolshevization of the East can still be prevented." The plan then made waves throughout Europe. Between 1929 and 1933, German-language newspapers alone devoted 450 articles to the mega-project. There were probably also many supporters in Hitler's circle who placed great hopes in such a project in order to achieve the later war aims. In 1938, Sörgel also turned to the Italian dictator Mussolini and propagated Germany and Italy as the future rulers of the whole of Europe and Africa. However, Mussolini was not at all enthusiastic about the plan to dry up the most important Italian ports and feared a loss of power. The tide was also turning in Berlin. The focus there began to shift early on to the ideology of living space in the East. And for the Nazi regime, Atlantropa still seemed too pacifist. Only after the conquest and colonization of both continents did they want to return to their plans. After all, Hitler had always been a supporter of gigantic construction projects. But with the defeat in the war, the plans quickly became history. Not entirely, however. While many of Sörgel's confidants turned their backs on him over time, he himself continued to be the project's biggest supporter. In the manner of a modern-day Elon Musk, he used elaborate multimedia propaganda to promote his work to the various post-war regimes. However, after the grueling war and the emerging East-West conflict, he naturally fell on deaf ears. He finally died in a bicycle accident in Munich in 1952, and the Atlantropa project was buried with him.